building alternative futures, which are more just, more equitable, where we are taking account of the kind of poly crisis that we're living in, which is not only about inequality, but also about climate crisis, and thinking what would it take to achieve social, economic and environmental justice. In lots of ways that goes right back to our roots. Joseph Rowntree at the beginning of the 20th century, himself a pioneer in many ways of all sorts of experiments through his work as a business owner, pioneered adult education, pension systems and so on, but also living in York and seeing the kind of squalor and some of the completely unacceptable housing conditions of workers. Instead of writing a pamphlet about it, or he actually said, well, there must be another way of doing this, and he built a village, a kind of a concrete utopia, if you like, of how things could be different. And this village, he had a vision for it, of it being about self-governing communities. The houses he built had a lot of natural light. They had gardens big enough for people to grow their own food. And I guess it's some of that energy, that active building of alternatives that people can see and feel and touch and understand what the future might look like, that we do have alternatives that we want to support through the Emerging Futures work. So in practical terms, what does that mean we're going to be doing? Well, we have been working with our trustees over the last year, and we are ring fencing a significant proportion of our endowment, about 50 to 100 million pounds over the next 5 to 10 years, to put in service of this work. So we want to be moving money into work where we're actively building these just and equitable futures, and that is going to be a major part of what we're doing. But it's not just about moving money. I think we also want to actively sort of build out our sense of what's possible, grow the field of possibility, in the words of Jeff Morgan in his recent book on this. So we're going to be doing lots and lots of work around that funding to weave together people, ideas, practices, to expand that sense of what might be possible. And we will be learning openly. So I think lots of us are now talking about what would it take to speed up the transition that we so urgently need to move through. The truth is, none of us exactly know. And so we are really committed in all of the work that we're going to be undertaking to be learning as openly as we possibly can, and to be thinking in terms of that wider ecosystem of all of us who are acting to try and speed up the transition. So anyway, really happy to kind of chat more if people want to hear more about that, but that's not, the programme itself isn't what we're going to be talking about today. So just a little bit, well, where do these events fit in? And to some extent, I think we should be upfront that these events are a bit of an experiment. So over the year, as we've been publishing things to share our thinking, we've sort of said, if you're interested in being part of an Emerging Futures community, sign up here, and an amazing number of you did. And so I guess in one way, these events are a response to that desire to come together. And so I think we put out a survey. Thank you so much to all of you who responded, but it was really clear from the results of that as well as people wanting funding and wanting resource for the work that they're doing, there is a clear desire for people to connect with others who are doing similar work, to build solidarity. And I think to recognise that if you are in the business of trying to build the new in the context of the old, it's blooming hard work. It can feel very lonely, very exhausting, like you're constantly fighting against the sort of gravitational pull of status quo. And so actually being in community with other people doing that work feels important, and that's certainly what you've told us in responding to the survey. So I guess what we're trying to do with these events is three things: to design spaces to connect and to share knowledge and to share learning and swap stories and all of that important stuff. And we talked in the first session, which I know some of you are at, about what does it mean to be a collective, and start to think about that. Secondly, we want to use these events to reflect on the practices that we might need to be bringing to this sort of future building work. And so, you know, in a way, I guess sort of working as a collective is a practice, working collectively is a practice that we talked a bit about last time. This time we're talking about learning and intelligence. And in our next event in December, which I do hope lots of you will come to, we'll be exploring risk and uncertainty as a sort of set of practices that we need to bring to this work. And then the third thing, so we wanted to connect, we wanted to reflect on practices. And then the third thing we wanted to do with these events was to learn more and to kind of share knowledge about concepts that feel important. So this term today, we'll be talking about ownership as a kind of foundational concept that we think seems to kind of appear in many contexts and across a lot of the work that everybody on this call is doing. Next time, we're going to look at the tiny subject of new economy. And again, I think it's we'll try and create a space where we can all bring our own experiences, knowledge, learning to that conversation. In terms of who is in the room, so we've got a brilliant array of people. Really happy to have my colleague Seppi Nuhi here. Seppi, give everyone a wave. So Seppi's from JRF and she's working with me on the Emerging Futures work. We also have Susie, Mona and Rachel, who are the wonderful women who make up the collective of Iris and Birch, and they have been working with us to design and facilitate these events. So really a joy to work with them, and I hope you all have fun meeting them today. You'll hear more from certainly Susie and maybe the others in a minute. But beyond that, there's all of you, and again we know from this, from what you've told us, that there's a kind of wonderful range and breadth of people here. Lots of you work across many different types of organisations, universities, charities, government, foundations, think tanks, and you have a kind of a shared interest in system change and futures thinking and imagination practice, but applied in many contexts, so across economics, ownership, climate, social justice, care, education and more. You bring clearly huge skills and knowledge. You're working in practices around young people, poverty, movement building, data research, democracy, finance, community and care. And I think also just to acknowledge that lots of you are bringing lived as well as professional experience to these issues. So it really is wonderful to have such an eclectic mix. And I think also what we know from the conversations we've had with lots of you is that some of you are kind of deeply embedded in this futures building work, and others of you are kind of newer to this space. And in that sense, I guess I just want to acknowledge that and say that in these spaces, we all bring expertise in some field, but we're all also learning in another. So I really want us to feel both expertise and kind of novelty, I guess, that actually bring a kind of learning and an open mindset and see what new things you might learn, as well as recognising the expertise that you're bringing. Yes, what are we doing today? Just to frame what we're doing today, a couple of reflections on last time. I know some of you were at our last event, and we're still in the process of synthesising that, and we will share something. But I guess 3 key takeaways from me about this conversation, this wonderful, rich conversation, and some singing that we had about working collectively. Firstly, I had this sentence in my notes, and I know someone said it, and I really don't think it was me, but I unfortunately didn't write down who did. So if it was you, please put your hand up, because I thought it was beautiful. Collaboration is the infrastructure that supports experimentation. And I just thought that is such an important thing for all of us to hold on. Collaboration as the infrastructure for experimentation. And it really links to something I find myself saying a lot. We don't have a blueprint for the future that we are painting by numbers to get to. And so there's something about when in fog, we need to hold hands. And so I think that really is such an important point to hold on to. We collaborate to experiment. And the other thing I guess I took from last time is that this work can be really hard and tiring and exhausting and uncertain. And I think that often comes from the fact that the sort of work that people are doing in this space doesn't fit easily into a sort of service delivery box. And nor does it often fit easily into a thematic box like care or education. Lots of you are working to try and change multiple interlocking systems in different ways. And so it can be really hard to find the language to talk about that in ways that others recognise easily. And maybe part of what we can do in these conversations is kind of find our way on that challenge together. So that's a couple of reflections from me, but as I say, we'll be sharing more on the synthesis of the overall event soon, so watch this space. Moving on to today, we've got some amazing speakers. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. I'm going to let Susie introduce them in a minute, but just to give you a kind of overview of what we're going to be doing today, we've got 2 questions to work on together. The first question is, how do we learn and practice together in order to build new collective knowledge and intelligence that contributes to the transition? So that's our first question. And the second question is about ownership. How and why could we reimagine ownership to support the transition towards an equitable future in which we all thrive? So those are the 2 questions that are going to scaffold our conversations today. In terms of the format, Susie, as I say, is going to introduce the speakers in a moment that we have on our first area of learning and intelligence to open up the debate. And we've asked them to speak for a little while each, just to kind of, I guess, provoke thoughts. Then we'll move into small breakouts for about 30 minutes. I don't know where we are in time after the Zoom complications at the beginning, so about 30 minutes, where we invite all of you to discuss, apply what you've heard to your own context, bring your own knowledge and understanding to the room. We'll return for a plenary and a short break, and then we'll repeat that whole process again, but this time on the subject theme of ownership, where we have another 2 brilliant speakers to kind of kick us off. So yeah, I hope you have a brilliant time today. Final word from me is just about the language and the fact that this sort of transitions work does feel to be like a kind of an emerging field, a new field, a field that's growing. And one of the things we grapple with in any new kind of work is language. And I hear a lot, there are 2 stories people tell about language in this world. One is, the language is too abstract, it's too conceptual, it's pretentious, I can't make sense of it, we need to make it more accessible. The other is, if we keep using language that is familiar and kind of the way things are now, it will kind of keep on pulling us back to the kind of frameworks and systems and mindsets that are actually holding us back from moving towards a fairer future. I think that's a tightrope we need to walk. But what we have done to sort of, I guess, engage and grapple with that debate around language is created a couple of resources, which I think we will put in the chat. We're creating a glossary of terms and a library of things that might be helpful. And I really invite you, if you hear in today's conversations language that feels unfamiliar or complicated or that you're unsure about, please add to these resources, help us make it better, because actually that in itself is a form of practicing collective learning. So let's just keep that kind of conversation open about language and how we use it. And in the spirit of us all being learners, I just wanted to conclude by sharing a question that I have at the moment that is kind of related to what we're talking about today, and that I spend a lot of time churning over. It's a bit of a long question, so Susie, you'll probably be cross with me. But so this is the question that I'm grappling with. How can we reveal the frameworks that are underpinning our notions of knowledge and ownership for what they are, which is a particular understanding of those concepts rooted in Enlightenment thinking, industrial capitalism, and how might we learn from alternative frameworks that are rooted in different histories and cultures? So that's a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I think it really shows up when we start talking about learning and intelligence, about what forms of knowledge we value. So that's enough from me. Over to you.
We are going to kick off the main section of this session today by looking at learning. And for me, I don't love the language of learning, actually. I do a lot of learning work, facilitate quite a lot of learning stuff, and I don't love it as a term. I prefer talking about intelligence and knowledge. And for me, learning is a way to get to intelligence and knowledge, and the intelligence, the new knowledge, and that buzzy kind of new knowledge stuff that we can do when we're working together. That's why we do learning, and that's the driver. We're going to hear from 2 people who spend all their working hours thinking about this stuff, are both really brilliant and implementing some fantastic work. I'm slightly fangirl here over both of them, and they'll give us a little whistle stop. 10 minutes each. I've given them 10 minutes each to give us a whistle-stop tour of what they are thinking about in regards to 2 quite specific questions about learning and intelligence. 10 minutes is nowhere near long enough. They could write PhDs about this stuff. So, you know, it's a bit unfair, but they'll give us some material that we'll then take out into breakout rooms to talk about together. And that's really what this is. This is material. They're giving us anchors or gateways. They're opening gateways to give us the fabric to start to weave with, so that we can build collectively some of our own intelligence around the stuff that we're hearing. Listen out, they're asking questions. We'll take those questions, we'll put them in the chat when they come, but we're taking those questions into conversation and we're using them to steer what we're thinking about. Again, I want to reiterate, we know that language can be a bit of an issue. We're hearing it all the time. I'm sure you all are as well. If you hear a word or a reference or, I don't know, a program or something that you've not heard of before, use this as an opportunity to grow and share with us that it's something you don't understand. And we'll do our best to help explain and to link to references. We have a reference library, we have a glossary, we're building them collectively, they're both open source, and hopefully those tools will end up being really useful to us all and more, our concentric circles, as we build this field that we're working in. Okay, when we've been thinking about this bit of the session, the team I work with have been thinking about an overarching question, which is how do we learn and practice together in order to build new collective knowledge and intelligence that contribute towards transition? And I guess what we're thinking, or what I'm thinking the whole time in my work, is about this sort of wilderness space we occupy. So I have one foot in the present, and I have one foot in the things I know, and I constantly have one foot in a place of uncertainty. We'll do more work on uncertainty in the next session, and a place of like lack of knowledge intentionally. And what I'm doing is I'm moving ideas around to try and create the knowledge that allows me to walk into that wilderness. For me, learning methodologies and practices are really critical to that. But there's lots to work out. How do we do it well? How do we manage the processes? How do we codify the knowledge? Once we're in these processes, how do we share it out? What do we do about monitoring and evaluation that have become so monolithic and all-consuming, particularly in the world of funding? And how do we move away from, I guess, some of the tense, terse material of the conversations that are happening in that evaluation space? I'm going to introduce the speakers now and let them talk to us. Use chat if you're listening and things come up for you in chat. Use chat. We won't do a Q&A with the speakers, so stick stuff down in the chat and then we can take that out into the breakout rooms and use that as some of the material when we're in the breakout rooms. Okay. Annika and Savi, would you both put your hands up so people can see you? Okay, so we're going to start with Savi. Savi Moll, she describes herself as, we're talking about someone when they're just there, describes herself as an international development professional. She has over 20 years of experience in monitoring, evaluation and learning, program and grant management, donor and client management and business development. At the moment, Savi's a senior evaluation manager at the Laudes Foundation. Laudes is brilliant. I run a learning program with them, so it's the first time I've met Savi, but I know members of her team pretty well. So Laudes is they deploy philanthropic capital, expertise and connections to work collectively with and through specific industries. At the moment, they're working with fashion and built environment, very focused on fashion and built environment, to help catalyse systems change. There's a dual focus to their work. So they focus on climate breakdown and deepening inequality and see those two things as really closely linked and connected. And their learning brief is very, very progressive. So they very much understand that their role as a foundation is a learning role, and there's lots of knowledge to acquire in order to increase capacity and improve performance. And they do that as an ecosystem approach, so in connection with their partners and then out into the value chains. That's the intro, Savi. I hope that represents things okay. And I'm going to leave Savi to do 10 minutes on what is learning, which again is stupid because that's a huge question. But over to you in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Susie. And good afternoon, everyone. I feel very humbled and privileged that there's a lot of knowledge in the room, and I'm only speaking from one angle. So just recognizing that as well. And thank you, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for having Laudes in the room. The conversation that we'll have today, and I know that I had a speaker brief, I had to prepare to have this conversation with all of you. It was about what is learning? How do we define it? How do we recognize it? How do we measure it? And I sat here wondering on my dining table, can we even measure learning? Or rather, is it that measurement should be in the service of learning? And the team that I'm a part of, called the Effective Philanthropy Team at Louders Foundation, is working towards that. So we see measurement and learning very interconnected. And thank you, Suvi, for alluding to that also in your introduction. So I will speak to our experience of measurement and learning at Louders Foundation, how we've tried to integrate it, what the experience has been. And just very briefly to add to also what Susie was talking about in terms of Louders is we're an independent foundation joining the growing movement to accelerate the transition to a just and regenerative economy. And we are responding to the dual crises of climate breakdown and inequality. Please note that they both are very long-term and very complex issues. And we are doing this by supporting brave action through our partners that we hope will inspire and challenge industry to harness its power for good. So we recognize that we are also in the business of contribution to systems change. It's complex. There is a lot of understanding of context involved as well. And therefore, we need to know that the context may change when we are operating with our partners. And what does that mean for us where we have to recalibrate? Where does learning come in for us there? So we had to be very intentional about learning. And I will talk to 3 points. What is traditionally understood as, missing gaps in learning, in evidence-based learning or not? And then looking at how we have attempted to integrate and make the link between learning and evidence and measurement, and what that means for us in real terms. And I could be talking theory for the next 8 minutes, but really, what does that mean? So the first thing is looking at how do we understand learning and how do we learn? So there are informal ways that we do that. We do that by conversations with partners, with our program teams, reading, having conversations with experts, but that helps us just to build some intuitive knowledge and make a judgment on where we need to change, where we need to learn. So that's informal. And what we intentionally did is also look at the formal ways of learning, is making sure that we have evidence, a base, a knowledge base for informing the way that we work, which informs our strategic adaptation cycle, which is an internal term that we use. Just explaining that term is also, we have annual strategy adaptation that takes place. So we want to make sure that there is an evidence link to that as well in terms of the annual planning cycle. And by formal sources of evidence, I would mean evaluations. It would also be, we have an evidence map as well, which will come out very soon in the public domain. But it also means codifying and having intelligence internally so that we are able to make change, but also have conversations with partners. So what does that mean in terms of the integration? I will just share a few slides, and then I will also come back to, of course, the reflection that I have in the last couple of months. So give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. So the first thing is really looking at how do we see, just putting a slideshow mode, sorry. Yes, so how do we see the focus that we have on learning within Louders Foundation? We call ourselves a learning organization, but we all know today we've given 3 hours of our time to learning, 2.5 hours of our time to learning, but time poverty is real. So again, we built intentionality on this. And for us, the 3 main areas of the building blocks of a learning organization are making sure that we have a supportive learning environment, that it's there as part of our mandate as well in our day-to-day work. And how does that really translate into real terms? It's about having concrete processes, learning processes in place. And I will talk to this about, having a learning agenda, which the program teams have had learning questions on. So we've gone back to program teams now, what is important or precious for you to answer? And how can we, with providing evidence, through what we have now. Again, I'm using a term and I'm mindful of this is a jargon, which is developmental evaluation. But this is a sort of non-traditional format where you have real-time loops on evidence coming in more regularly than a traditional approach that gets evidence at the end of an initiative or a project. So we are also wanting to build in cycles of inputting evidence when we need for answering learning questions that program teams have. We've got learning rituals in place for program teams to also do, but this is all championed by the system leaders, which are called learning champions, and I'm one of them. So it's making sure that we hold space for learning within conversations of program teams, but also within the foundation as well, and with our partners and the wider field. And how does the measurement piece play here? Let me talk about this for a minute, is also on the way that we have kind of looked at a new way of measurement and learning, which speaks to systems thinking. And this is the rubrics and rating system that we are using as a measurement and learning framework, where we have rubrics, and these are 4 levels of rubrics. Just very quickly speaking from left to right, is the A rubrics are talking about the quality of the initiative. What does a good initiative look like? Do we have the right ingredients, the right capacities to create change and to contribute to change, which are the B and C rubrics, or really looking at the early and later changes as well that are taking place because of the work of our partners. And then also looking at defining what 2030 impacts we would like to see in the system. But all of this is very important for us because it helps us define what good looks like. And that is important when we are learning. So if you want to know where we need to reach, what good looks like, we have a rating scale. And this rating scale is a 5-point rating scale. So we have definitions for what harmful, conducive, and supportive, for example, would look like for each of the 21 rubrics that I shared in the earlier slide. So the idea is we are able to measure where we are, to know where we are through this framework, but also learn or where we need to adapt and change. And this is really the way that we have integrated learning within our measurement system, because we also need to recognize that we need to learn to learn. And then we have a few questions that are very important for us to answer. And most of these are also sitting within our partner reporting templates. Are we doing the right things right? Do we have the right ingredients? Do we have them in the right mix? How are we contributing to early changes? What is the evidence to that? How are we contributing to later changes? And then essentially, what are we learning? And I will speak to a couple of examples also just before I close the conversation as well. The part here is on what are we learning is something that I've seen consistently as, so I've worked with the foundation for 6.5 years, Senior Foundation, Loudest Foundation. And I do lessons note for most of the evaluations that we do, and these are on our website. And there are recurrent lessons that come out. And we see that what are we learning is a question that gets asked by all of us. But what does this mean in real terms? What does it imply in terms of, having these sort of lessons? Do the program teams even listen? What is taken into annual planning? Because we are actually codifying intelligence. We have intelligence. We know when we need to adapt. And the only other thing that we are very aware of is that sometimes, and this has happened to me a lot recently, is like, oh, Savi, but we haven't learned anything new. This is the same lesson. But the lessons will continue to come up when we are not paying attention or not giving them the credit that they are due for. Giving you concrete examples of the kind of lessons, and you'll see this on our learning page on the Loudest Foundation website, is that grants are too short. And we know for systems change, it takes time. So how do we intentionally calibrate our grant cycle durations is something we need to unpack. The other one is all of us also recognize that system change requires collaboration between different actors. and that collaboration takes time. And there is always an impatience around collaboration. And this is another recurrent lesson. So there are two recurrent lessons that I have on top of my head on what comes out from these evaluations. And these have come out in this year's pilot on the developmental evaluation, when we've since made with our program teams as well. And then there's the question of, but there is no new lesson. That keeps coming back to us. What is, and I'm like, you have not even dealt with the ones before. And what the evidence is saying continuously is validating your lesson, that you already know this, but we are not doing anything about it. So my challenge question is basically, if we have an appetite, and what is our appetite for learning, are we also able to digest lessons? Are we aware of the trade-offs if we do digest or we don't? And are we ready to deal with the implications of digesting them either way, even if we intend to? There are budgetary implications, there are human resource implications. How do we digest learning? I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm like furiously scribbling down things that I want to go write an end of year report, but I'm just going to write down some of these things, Savi. I think really struck me is that time poverty thing, which we experience the whole time when we're trying to create learning environments, is it gets deprioritized, and we understand why, right? Deadlines and milestones become more important and the learning bit falls off, but actually the change is going to come from that learning space. So that really resonated with me, and the idea of needing to be intentional and create purpose around this is really, like, that's the foundation of all of this, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to go straight on to Annika and not do much more on the reflecting side, because we will reflect in the group conversations after this. Annika is, so Annika describes herself as a systems thinker working on climate justice, reimagining learning, and how we make real change. And she specifies beyond the cult of good intentions, which talks so well to Savi's kind of close there. She works at Huddlecraft, where her title is Partnerships and Comms Director, but I think that the Huddlecraft team move around but don't really sit comfortably within those titles. What Huddlecraft do is so many different things, but they have a nice way of kind of neatly describing it. They say that they help people and organizations climb collective learning curves, which I really like as a description. There's a ton of juicy information on their website about the approaches they use, why they're using those approaches, what an evolving ecosystem looks like, starting from a learning perspective. And I really do recommend going over there to have a bit of a read. There's a direct quote which I love. Huddlecraft is all about the alchemy created by co-learners, small groups of people that combine to become more than the sum of their parts. The more than the sum of the parts thing is so important. If we just think into either our individual brain or into the silo of our organization or whatever collective entity we are built within, then we don't get anywhere. We just hit the boundaries the whole time. So that opening up, that more than the sum of the parts, is the key. Right, 10 minutes, Annika, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Susie, and thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with you all and explore this absolutely huge topic of learning. So I'm going to share some slides. So as Susie said, I'm from Huddlecraft, and we're an ecosystem of approaches for peer-to-peer learning and change. And we're here today to talk to you about this question: why do we need learning? And I feel like most of you already know the answer to this. Most of you know probably most of what I'm about to say. But we know that the level of change that we need in this decade, this crucial decade, is enormous and unprecedented. And if we're going to have a hope of creating a regenerative future where people and planet can thrive and flourish, we're going to need to undergo deep shifts and transformations in every way. And so that's going to require us to do things we haven't done before. And so what do we do when we're tackling intertwined challenges that we haven't collectively faced before at this scale, at this depth, at this level of complexity? Well, I think we all know that it's not like school where there was a back of the textbook where you could find the answers. It's not like there's an all-encompassing university curriculum that you can just sign up to and go on. And there isn't one wise individual out there who knows everything. So the only way towards another tomorrow is to inquire, is to ask questions, to be curious, to step into the unknown and to learn. And as Susie said, we at Huddlecraft believe that the story of the 21st century will be a story about the steepest collective learning curve in human history. And we believe that learning is needed at a scale we've never needed before. And further to that, not just learning, but collective learning, we believe, is needed more than ever before because of what it's able to unlock. And so our approach at Huddlecraft is based on 3.5 pillars. So the first pillar is this, that we believe people can learn to thrive on this finite planet, which I have to say is something that I don't always feel so connected to sometimes when you read what's going on in the news and you know, some of the headlines that we see every day and some of the experiences that people have every day, people who we know and love. It's really hard sometimes to believe that it is possible to learn together to thrive on this finite planet. But that's a belief that underpins our work. And the second bit is not a belief, but a thing that we know, which is that our potential as humans to learn is infinite. We have an infinite capacity to grow and to learn if we put the right attention to that. And the third piece is about the collective learning. What we have seen at Huddlecraft through 6 years of doing this work is how peer groups, so that's people coming together in small groups, can unearth potential that people can't unearth individually on their own. And the kind of half a pillar is that we also know that actually what is really required to unearth that potential is craft. It's a skill, it's an art in bringing people together. You can't just chuck people together and say, right, solve all the problems. That's not how it works. And so what I want to share is 3 examples of how we have been designing and creating collective learning environments and learning cultures in a few different settings. So the first example is huddles, and that is something that we have been, which really is the roots of our practice at Huddlecraft. It's where we draw up the learning that we then apply to everything else that we do. And a huddle is simply a purposeful peer group that tackles a learning journey together over a period of time. And we train people up across the world to host huddles, to host these peer groups around a completely eclectic range of different themes that people come up with themselves. And so here are some of the themes that people host peer groups around. People also host peer groups in place-based peer groups from Birmingham to Brazil to Berlin. And some peer groups are identity-based. So I've hosted a peer group in Birmingham of people exploring social change. And I've also been on a peer group, been a participant on a peer group, which is a peers of colour group of people of colour coming together to explore different learning questions. And that's the kind of second piece of what makes a huddle, that everybody in a peer group, which is usually around 12 people, has a learning question, a learning inquiry. And these really are inquiries rather than the idea of accumulating knowledge. They're questions that people decide on and set for themselves. And then over the course of, let's say, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, people explore that learning question in a way that makes sense to them, but in community alongside 10, 11 other people also exploring their own learning questions. And so I've put this slide up not for you to read what those learning questions are, but for you to see that those learning questions end up playing with each other and intertwining. And so you might be exploring one thing over here, but somebody else in your group is exploring something completely differently. But actually, by going on a journey in parallel with each other, you end up recognizing how these different topics can intertwine and what you might learn from each other. And so in coming together as a group, developing trusting, supportive relationships over a series of time, there's a real cross-pollination that can occur when people learn out loud and navigate their learning journeys together, because we're each bringing completely different worldviews, contexts, perspectives, skills. And as a result, we can ask questions, contribute suggestions, and collaborate on ideas that enhance everybody's shared learning and understanding, as well as enhance the individual's learning journey. And so the structure of a peer group enables individuals to learn more, to create more, and to grow more than they would be able to do alone. And we think there's a real power in the companionship of learning, which we think is really vital, given that the level of uncertainty and the unknown out there of these steep learning curves can feel really scary, can feel really difficult when we're feeling the effects of them so closely. And so there's a real power in being able to stay on those learning journeys through going through them together. The second example I want to share is about neighbourhood donor economics. And some of you may be really familiar with this work, especially if you came to Civic Square's brilliant neighbourhood donor celebration, which just happened last week. So Civic Square have been exploring the idea of donor economics, which is a set of economic ideas pioneered by and brought together by Kate Raworth. And they've been exploring how these ideas can work at a neighbourhood scale for several years now. And they've known for a long time that other people have been interested in doing the same work. And so we, as Huddlecraft, worked with them to create a distributed set of peer-to-peer learning journeys, where we recruited hosts from across the UK and further afield, some of whom are in this room today, which is really exciting to see you. And these hosts brought together groups of people, small groups of people from all sorts of different places, from Sandwell to Dudley, from Cheltenham to Scotland, to teach each other about the ideas within the book Donor Economics, and to teach each other about ideas related to those ideas that they were drawing from their own experience. And then they experimented together with how they'd bring these ideas to life in their neighbourhoods. And these journeys took place over a course of about six to 9 months. And for many people, they're still ongoing. And as a result of these learning journeys, these learning intentions that people held together, this kind of fairly light touch scaffolding that we created, people from all walks of life have come up with all sorts of different projects and engaged in some of these ideas around what we describe as the new economy. People have experimented with guerrilla gardening projects, community retrofit experiments, using virtual reality to help children reimagine their local high street, all sorts of different things. And I'd be here for a lot longer than 10 minutes if I was to share all of those with you here today. But the thing that that was really magic about this was the invitation to join a learning journey in a local neighbourhood unlocked a sense of curiosity and possibility that was already within people. They unlocked practice around economic ideas and how to bring these ideas to life, rather than just theorising, rather than it just being something that you read about in a book, think, oh, that's interesting, and then put on your shelf. And it was the intimate relationships and the collective learning within these peer groups that fueled the courage to explore and practice what it means to step into the unknown. And there was something really powerful about the momentum and the connectivity that many of these small groups travelling alongside each other was able to contribute to the overall learning journeys. So the third example I'll go into is something called Money Movers. And Money Movers is based around a question, which is, how can we make it easier for people to take climate action with their personal finances? And if you're anything like me, you really care about climate change, but you don't really care about your bank account or your pension as much as that. The idea of engaging with that feels a bit abstract, boring, complex. And so when Friends of the Earth came to us with this question, how can we make it easier for people to take action? We co-designed a micro learning program of 3 sessions where people would get together with their friends and their colleagues to learn about this idea of greening your finances and take action together. And the way it works is that we train up hosts. So this approach is really distributed. And then those hosts have a light touch micro program and bring together women around dinner tables and Zoom rooms to have these conversations, learn together, share what they're learning, and support each other to take action. And the brilliant thing is that it really works. This form of learning, this form of peer learning in small groups where people are teaching each other rather than there being an expert, it's really catalyzed action. And so far in our pilots, 140 women have moved £1.2 million for climate action. And so we really see that there's huge potential for learning and community-based learning to create significant impact and ripples of change that we know are the core ingredients of systemic shifts. And from the pilots, we've got this question now of, can we, through this power of community learning, as everyday people, not as billionaires, can we together move £1 billion for the planet by 2030? And what is the message that that will send to institutions, to financial institutions and governments, if a group of ordinary women are together moving their money? So those are 3 examples of how collective learning can help us take steps further towards the emergent futures that we know we need to see in the world, and how collective learning can help us do that in a way that we can't so easily do alone. And at Huddlecraft, we see peer-to-peer learning as an enabling infrastructure for so much of the work that so many of us are already doing. We think it could be like the mycelium in the soil that enables all sorts of new things to emerge and grow. So the question I want to leave you with, given that we are on the steepest collective learning curve in history, is what potential could peer-to-peer learning or collective learning help to unlock within your place, your organisation, and your movement? What's the potential you might be able to harness through weaving learning more deeply, more intentionally, and more collectively throughout your work? So I'll leave it there, but I'm really excited to see what comes up and what you discover through the sharing that you'll be doing in the groups.
Can I just have a couple of sentences of feedback from what you were hearing in your rooms? Who can I see? Seppi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. So we had a wonderful conversation. We began with Savi's provocation of and about the importance of collective learning, and summarizing it, we came to the conclusion that it's more efficient because we get to start from the place where others have reached, and we can learn collectively in symbiosis, which is far better than working individually. And towards the end, Becca from Save the Children posed an amazing question, which got everyone thinking right at the end of our conversation, which was, what do we do with all the information that we've generated from our evaluation reports, all like external learning we do? What do we do once we've published the report? It just sits on the website, or it's just in our brain. And then how do we repeat, like bring in the learning throughout the course of future planning? And how do we make it an iterative process? And who is asking questions to bring this conversation up again? And what are the questions being asked? And we didn't come to a conclusion. We posed that to the group as well, because we don't know. We'd love to learn.
Great, thank you. Yeah, similar things come up for us. And just to take that back to Savi's presentation, Savi talked about closing feedback loops a little bit. So there's definitely this thing around, what does iterative practice in learning look like? And that's where the codifying comes in. All right, who else? Rachel.
Hi, yeah, we had a really interesting conversation. I wrote down a ton of quotes, which I will try to write up later. But yeah, we talked a lot about peer-to-peer learning and the value of peer-to-peer learning, but particularly about the value of peer-to-peer learning within a kind of container, whether that's an organization or a network or something like that, because as Ali very clearly pointed out, the people learning are not the people in power. So there's this disconnect between the people who are really actively trying to unlearn old systems and old ways of working, and the people who are in the power and have the ability to make that change. And so we also did not come up with the answers, but Rachel kind of very concisely summed up a few points at the end, one of which was kind of the need for like a sandbox, so having areas to play and learn, but with kind of some boundaries of kind of what we're trying to do with that learning, kind of feeding into what Savvy was talking about. How do we digest the things that we're learning?
Great, thank you. Sapphire?
Yeah, loved our conversation, and also loving hearing the feedback and reading the chat on what everyone else is saying. So we talked about loads of stuff, and Camille asked a really important question, I think, about kind of where does power sit in peer learning, and being mindful that if we're trying to learn kind of across disciplines and practices, power will play out, and that we need to kind of be mindful of that. And Roger and Stuart talked in different ways about kind of whether we have time to learn, given the place we're in, the urgency of the climate crisis, and actually we don't have time necessarily for kind of 10 to 15 year deep evaluation programs. But we got from there into a conversation which Alistair was talking about, sort of designers and their mindset around learning, which is all about the kind of experimentation and iteration versus learning in a kind of policy and research context, which is much more about kind of backward looking evidence. So I guess we're in that kind of like, what is the just enough learning to keep us moving forward, is probably the best way of summarising what we were talking about.
I would say that was a big chunk of our conversation as well. Agility and iterative practices seems to have come up across the board. And what's the difference between looking back and monitoring and generating insight? And then what do you do with the insight? And it's that seems to be the general place that we're at. Okay, Mona.
Yes, so first there's a theme coming up around culture, around learning, and the importance of how we need to create a culture that asks us to repeatedly show up and commit to show up for the learning spaces. It's not a once-off thing, it's a cultural practice. And then there's some identification of tensions in this, like learning across the field, where it seems to a lot of us that the learning cycle of trying things out, learning and digesting that happens a lot faster on the ground than on a strategic level, which is a real tension between funders and people who receive money to do the work. And then there's a tension around whether or not we need a roadmap to navigate into the future, or whether we can start from a different angle. And that obsession with roadmaps needs to be challenged across the field. And I think the last note that happened before we left the room was systems change requires experimentation, and experimentation will inevitably lead to failure, and we need to learn from that failure, which I think was a beautiful synthesis of what we need in this space.
So that also came up for us, and that kind of idea that your evaluation can show that you did a poor job, you made no impact, and of course that matters. And impact is important, but if we can learn from the reasons that meant that the impact wasn't there and feed that back into the ecosystem, then that becomes valuable in a different way. We create a different type of value, and that's the ecosystem approach, right? The one other thing I think that we haven't touched on, I haven't heard anyone else touch on, is I had people in my room who are in receipt of funding that has no KPIs attached to it, radical trust on the monitoring and evaluation side, and people who have to monitor against every single output KPI that was identified at the funding process, and neither is good. Actually, there needs to be some parameters, and people want to know that they're making impact, but it needs to not be so heavily designed that there's no room to iterate and then therefore to learn, really. Okay. Change of focus. We're looking through a different lens now, and we're looking at a thorny subject area that we feel is crucial to unpacking, unlocking, changing, shifting the future that we want to live in. So we're exploring ownership. Ownership is massive, it's complicated, it is everything really, isn't it? We will probably end up because of who we have talking, partly also because of the way that conversations about ownership tend to move in land and property. But ownership is bigger than land and property. What the commons is a question that relates to all sorts of ownership. So when we're in conversation, I really encourage you to keep that open framework. Don't just talk about houses. We will obviously only scratch the surface now, but I'm hoping what we'll see is some channels beginning to deepen through conversation where we know that we need to do more exploration. Alistair and Mark are both older in the tooth now, aren't you both? I mean, very young, but have been doing this, focusing, specializing in this space for a while and have a lot of incredible insight that they'll share with us. We are lucky. It's not fair. I've given them 10 minutes to explore a massive question. That's not fair. This is my script, it's what I wrote down. But who doesn't love a challenge? You can both talk to me afterwards. Again, this is about inquiry. This is about opening up space for us to have a conversation, giving us some material to work with. It's not about them giving us answers or us necessarily finding the answer in the 20 minutes, 25 minutes we have afterwards. It's about inquiring. Same as before, if there are words, references, frameworks, models you don't understand, let us know. Let's add to that glossary and add to the library. And again, when we were designing, our overarching question for this was how and why could we reimagine ownership to support transition towards an equitable future in which we all thrive? So broadly here, this is about transcending the models that we currently are stuck in. I think that's fair, stuck, a little bit stuck. They're tied up in capitalism. They're inevitably, therefore, also tied up in colonialism. How do we move past them? I personally am interested in the growth word that keeps getting thrown around and the extractive nature of growth and how that all relates to ownership. I'm also interested in privilege and the idea of investment and who privileges, who gains, who is privileged by being able to invest and own and who therefore isn't. And that's really all I'm going to say. So I'm going to introduce Mark first. Mark founded an organisation called Shared Assets in 2012, which feels like it should be yesterday, but is actually 10 years ago, to respond to the need for new models of managing land for the common good in the face of public sector austerity. So lots has changed. And to enable groups working on environmental issues to gain access to land to deliver their projects. He describes himself as specialising in facilitating complex partnerships and supporting people to work together to meet shared objectives. Shared Assets have a really brilliant, concise tagline. They say they are reimagining what we can do with land together. And that really tells you everything you need to know about why he's here. Okay, 10 minutes on who owns what and why should we care? Good luck.
Thank you, and hello everybody. Yeah, so a history of ownership in 10 minutes. The wonderful 3 acres and a cow take about 3 hours to do this in song and story. So I'm going to be less expansive and less entertaining. So go and see them if you get a chance. But yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I joined about 30 other people in a small community space in Oxford to discuss who owns Oxford. And at the meeting, like 2 people who were behind that project described like the struggle that they had to source data to try and visually map out land ownership around the city. But the maps that they produced sort of sparked amazing conversations about development and wealth and decision making and what we mean by public and calls for direct action in local land disputes amongst the people gathered. And I was struck by the idea that we have to convene meetings, crowdfund donations, and apply hours of volunteer labour to find out who owns the land around us is extraordinary in itself. But the galvanising effect that data had on a room full of people was also really instructive. And finding out who owns the land around us is difficult in this country. We have a land registry, but it costs like £3 per pinpoint query, so you'd need like £72 million to buy all 24 million land titles in the country, even if you didn't do any duplicates. And I don't think that lack of transparency is an accident. There's a profound silence about ownership and particular land ownership in this country. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But when people do work out and find out who owns the land around them, there's kind of some usual suspects that always appear in the top 10. So the church, the local aristocracy, more recent wealthy individuals, the crown, maybe the local university, central government, local government, corporate owners like developers and pension funds. So even if we leave aside kind of questions of wealth and inequality around that, it's clear that, you know, from that list that ownership and power go hand in hand. These are all kind of the powerful institutions. So how do we get here? Why is it so hard to change? In the UK context, you know, we'll always go back to 1066 when we talk about land ownership, and kind of William the Conqueror declaring all the land belonged to the crown, and then doling it out to barons and the church in a direct bid to secure power. And so for the next sort of 500 to 600 years, ownership conferred power over the local peasantry and the rights to raise rents and taxes and tithes. But it also meant, you know, you had a trusted advisor role to the crown. But what it didn't do necessarily was mean exclusion, and the right to exclusive use of that land. So other people who didn't own the land had rights of use for kind of grazing and agricultural use and foraging. And that only really began to change in the 16th, 19th centuries when we had the series of enclosure acts, and landowners began to see that they could personally profit from the improvement and use of their land. And so sought to remove other people from the land and prevent them from using it for subsistence. And so I think during this period, you sort of see like a movement from this like idea of a mosaic of different rights associated with a piece of land to this more monolithic conception of ownership based on kind of control and exclusion, and the exploitation of the land to generate private wealth. And even then, you know, legally, ownership is thought of not as a single thing, but as a bundle of different rights. So quite often broken down into like the right to exclude and the right to control and the right to enjoy and the right to kind of lease out for other purposes. So I think, you know, you can see this kind of changing notion about what we mean by ownership that might be useful to revisit. And it's also during that period that we begin to see the rise of like the big trading companies and colonial expansion that Susie talked about earlier. And you know, these companies were granted the same rights as individuals to own land and to own property, and you know, often through theft and violence, took large areas of land overseas for exploitation, and that process is often associated with enslavement and dispossession and the transfer of large quantities of wealth back to the UK, both to existing landowners and newly enriched individuals who then purchased estates in the countryside, with the wealth generated through that process of colonialism and enslavement. And those legacies, I think, of generational dispossession and wealth accumulation continue to this day. And you can see kind of concentrated wealth of individuals alongside the fact that UK citizens of Black and Asian heritage have less wealth and assets even now than white UK citizens, having been dispossessed, then come to a country where actually through that process of dispossession, land and property has been concentrated enormously and is hard to break into. And there's also the kind of the raw political power that came with ownership. So it's only in the 19th century that anyone other than landowners could vote. And we only got rid of hereditary peers in 1999. And also in the kind of colonial countries, countries that we colonized, we put in similar types of legislatures where only landowners could participate quite often. And even kind of when disquiet about land concentration kind of led to things like the Allotments Act to give people the ability to grow their own food. Allotments were sized so that you could supplement your food so that the factory owner could pay you less, but they weren't so large that you could actually subsist and be self-sufficient, and not have to sell your labor at all. So even there, yeah, the sort of the ability to control who has access to land comes in. And then during the 20th century, sort of the rise of public ownership, local authorities creating public infrastructure, libraries, community centres, sports facilities, and national level things like Forestry Commission and MOD, and also the expansion of kind of charitable ownership for public benefit through things like the National Trust and the RSPB. And that kind of public ownership of land and assets kind of peaked in the late 20th century. And then, yeah, since the 80s, we've seen sell-offs of public land and assets that have accelerated sort of since the financial crash. And it's been particularly poorer communities that have seen the loss of public housing, community centres, sports facilities. And in these areas where the market and state have retreated, we've seen the rise of new forms of collective or community ownership, like shops and pubs and community centres, development of community land trusts for housing. And in Scotland, where there's been legislative and funding support, there's over 200,000 hectares of land in community ownership. And quite often these kind of community ownership initiatives are sort of framed as community empowerment. They're about providing communities with control over their own resources, leading to improvements in local economic and social conditions. But I think even with those processes, we've still got a highly concentrated land ownership. So 69% of land in the UK owned by about 0.6 of the population. And I said I'd talk a bit more about the silence on this, and I think it's really important. It's not just about the lack of information and how hard it is to find out who owns what. But I've personally been told by when trying to engage landowners in public conversations about land ownership, that they won't enter into the conversation. We won't talk about that. I've been told by grant managers that their trustees are landowners and won't fund this kind of work. I've been advised by my own board members that we shouldn't talk about land reform because it might not be good for business. And this experience is confirmed by research that we undertook with Future Narratives Lab about kind of current land narratives and how attempts to change the current system are shut down. And their work found that the current land system is portrayed as this fixed outcome of history, whereas even from that brief canter through, you can see that it's not fixed at all. It's changed enormously. And also that land is a scarce resource that we have to compete for. So change is either dangerous and destabilizing to that fixed institution, or it's ridiculous and idealistic and fringe and can be dismissed. And so I think anyone trying to change the current land system faces that kind of silencing. And they also have to operate in market dynamics that mean that they struggle to create sustainable business models in areas with low amounts of wealth and disposable income, sometimes even taking community-owned and controlled assets out of the reach of local people and groups who are then not able to use them because they have to charge prices that aren't affordable. So I think silence, this monolithic conception of ownership being exclusive and without wider responsibilities, and this marketization of land and assets are all challenges that we face in conceiving of new approaches. And all of these came up at that Oxford meeting a couple of weeks ago. How do we find out who owns that piece of land? How do we find out what their intentions are for it? Why can't we use it for social benefit? How do we find affordable places to meet and organize? And we should care about this because ownership confers power and it enables autonomy of action. It gives people a stake, and dispossession marginalizes and impoverishes. So how, I think, questions I want to raise, and I'll pop a succinct version of this in the chat, but how do we break the silence that makes ownership and make ownership discussions part of everyday conversation? Can we develop new assumptions and norms about ownership and new mosaics of rights, kind of revisiting those less monolithic approaches to ownership, and create the new forms of collective governance that would be needed to support them? And how do we really take land and buildings out of the market so that they're not caught up in these financialized dynamics, and so that we can create free and open spaces for people to meet and organize and meet their needs on a local basis? So yeah, my succinct version of that I'll just put in the chat is basically, how do we break the silence around ownership and power so that we can develop new models of ownership and governance?
Slightly tearing up. This happens when people ask the question that goes right into the heart. Yeah, I mean, the circling, I really enjoy this reframing as the mosaic of rights that's really useful. That's a really helpful way to break the determinism that's underpinning so much of this. So yeah, for me, that's very helpful. Thank you. And then loads. Really, you know, I work in the investment layer of real estate, in the decarbonising built environment, trying to work with the investment lot to decarbonise. And there's so many questions that come out of that then talk directly to the stuff that you're saying that we haven't even touched on in your talk around what the, Alistair, maybe we'll get there in the next bit, but just the interrelationships here are so fierce and rich, and there's so much tension to explore. So not being very eloquent. The other thing is that word asset. It just struck me. I've been uncomfortable with the asset word for a very long time. I was just looking at what it actually means, and it means a useful or valuable thing. And we use it more specifically as a piece of property, but a useful or valuable thing. And that kind of obfuscation around the land and ownership by saying asset is like, you know, that is the silencing, isn't it? All the what that not clever use of language. Anyway, right, I'll stop talking. Alistair, I'm going to introduce Alistair. Alistair runs Open Systems Lab, which is an R&D studio working on new operating systems for society. He describes himself as an inventor and a designer. Brilliant. So far his work's been focused on transforming the systems that underpin the way we plan, create and own homes, neighbourhoods and the built environment. He's focused on how we can use digital technology and the web to make flourishing, prosperous, equitable and zero carbon cities and economies. And he has so many ideas. So when I said to Alistair, will you do this? He was like, oh, I have so many questions. So let's see where we go with this. Over to you.
Amazing, thank you very much. And it seems somehow an appropriate reflection of a broader truth that Mark has just made my life a heck of a lot easier because I can stand on his shoulders here. So let's launch into this 10-minute canter through what this huge question, what could the future of ownership look like? And of course, we can only really start that by asking ourselves this kind of ridiculous stoner question of, well, what actually is ownership? It's a sort of concept that makes total sense until you think about it. You know, why is it that I can own a home, and why that cost something like £350,000? It's not the bricks, you know, your house is mostly just a heap of old bricks. You wouldn't get much for them on eBay. Most of what makes that expensive, makes it unaffordable indeed, is the land underneath it. But again, the land has always been here. It's been there for millennia, and it'll be here for millennia after us as well. So what is ownership? And there we get to our first obvious truth that we've already touched on, that ownership is really essentially a piece of paper. It is a conferred set of rights, this bundle of rights that gives you monopoly rights and obligations over a place. And depending what those rights and obligations are, that's what gives it its financial value, whether it's to exclude others or to live there or whatever it might be. And if someone tries to mess with those rights, policemen will turn up and defend those rights. So property is a piece of paper, and it's really important to not be suckered into thinking, into forgetting that when we ask ourselves about why it's so unaffordable. Again, we've already touched on this. Where did it come from? Broadly speaking, there's oversimplification, of course, but exactly as you say, like our land system broadly, we can track it back to 1066 and William the Conqueror and the problem of medieval kings. And the specific problem that medieval kings has is how do I control the country? How do I fund military campaigns without having a standing army and without having a kind of organized bureaucracy? And the answer was, this piece of paper effectively said William said to his dukes and nobles, if you're loyal to me and if you provide soldiers whenever I ask them, in exchange, I will give you your own private fiefdom. And within that fiefdom, you are essentially in charge, and you can raise taxes as high as people can bear to pay. So that's our kind of second big kind of, or sort of next moment, is rent is the original tax. And this is an important concept to take into everyday lives. Rent is privatized tax. It's a form of tax that the poor have to pay to the wealthy just for having money. So there's our kind of second point. And again, Mark has already aced this point. Property is power. It has always been power. It is a tradable form of power. That's what gives it its value, the power to tax people. That's why we call it becoming a landlord. Isn't that weird that you can buy the right to be a lord over someone? And again, the history that Mark's really touched on. The history of political power in the UK is the history of property, and it still is to a large extent. And the history of property is also the history of power. This, by the way, is not something you will hear reflected in the language of housing policy wonks, in which I kind of partially include myself. They will talk about things like affordability ratios. But if you actually spend time listening to people who are just about to be evicted by their landlord, or having to put their children to bed in a room full of moldy spores, the language they will use will be much more about power. They will talk about their powerlessness, their frustration, their anger at the blatant injustice of it. And I think it's a really, really important reminder, again, to that way that we shroud and obfuscate the language around this system. And the third important kind of point to set up here is that property is eating absolutely everything. Both in a very literal sense, that the value of these pieces of paper, these privatized taxation rights, are not just the biggest form of wealth in the world, they're the biggest form of wealth by an order of magnitude. 80% of all the wealth in the UK is this. And of course, it's not really wealth at all, it's impoverishing us, because when we look at all the interconnected, horrible kind of effects of inflated land value has, it lies at the root of all of the complex issues that so many of us are so familiar with. You will always find this system waiting at the end of the corridor of every single system, sitting there in the roots. It's the biggest driver of inequality and poverty, failing economies, flatlining productivity, generations taxing rent, debt, depression, loneliness. I can move quickly through this. The incentives it creates around land speculation and creates these rubbish development models, which is why we build such poor quality, unsustainable development neighborhoods. And of course, climate crisis. The property system underpins, when you think about it, you look at the source of emissions, it underpins 62%, either indirectly or directly underpins this. So it's not an exaggeration to say that this is I would argue, the single biggest, most important reform project of our time. It's up there with the abolition of slavery. It is huge. And I do not see a path to a sustainable, flourishing, successful future for humanity without us doing something about this. It's that serious. So what could the future of ownership look like? And again, if we boil it down into its smallest possible thing, it comes down to this, which is that fundamentally, we can treat land as being a good investment, or we can treat it as a good platform, but we can't treat it as both, as we said, because a good investment goes up in value, and a good platform is like the cost of internet or the cost of oxygen. You want it to be as low as possible, right, and as widely available, and that's what boosts, that makes your economy and your society flourish. The more we have to spend on land, the less we have to spend on literally everything else. So, and of course, there's a myriad housing policies trying to kind of somehow dance and reconcile these two. But this is ultimately the kind of truth of it, is that what we want is a society in which land is a low cost, is conceived as a low cost platform instead of a high cost financial asset. The good news is that we've known what the answer is. There's a really simple solution to this, and we've known about it for quite a long time, thanks to economists like Henry George and advocates later that came along, like even included Winston Churchill, which is a big shift in our taxation system. So instead of taxing people's incomes, we say, hey, landowners, you don't get to keep that those privatized taxation rights anymore. We're going to have a big shift in our taxation system. So we'll actually collect the land values back to the community who created them. And that means we got more money, but also potentially we could cut taxes. There's a problem though, right? Which is it would work, right? It would bring down the asset value of land, that's stored power, because now to those rights, you're adding an obligation, right? So it would reduce the value of land. And of course that would, it would break our banking system, it would bring down pension funds, quite before we even get to the political fight that would be required to get there. This is, to again coin a phrase, to borrow a phrase, this is the mother of all vested interests. And almost all of us in this room, despite the fact I suspect we're all in our different ways trying to fight against this system, we are also vested in it, usually in some way or another. But is there another way? There is another way. for the community, at whatever scale you think about it, to capture the rents from property. And that, of course, is to own the land in the first place, to buy it. And this is how Singapore, for example, if you've ever wondered, how is it that Singapore has such low taxes and yet has the world's 8th largest sovereign wealth fund? This is why, because the state owns all the land and only leases it to people. And they've got, this colossally huge sovereign wealth fund. The UK, the size of the UK sovereign wealth fund is 0. Probably less, actually. But also, of course, this is exactly what's been happening being done by community land trusts, right? So when communities do manage to get ownership of that land, to own it for the purpose of public purpose, that's another way of doing things. But they also began to do something else that's really, really interesting. They said, cool, we can, we own that land, great. Now we can collect the rents or the property values of that land. But actually they said, no, wait a minute, we don't necessarily want to get the maximum financial value out of that land, because we don't see land as a financial asset. We see land as a platform to benefit society, the economy, and the environment. So actually, what if we took this thing and we unbundled it? We unbundled that bundle of rights. And this is a kind of framework that we've been kind of coming up with. My colleague Ollie is here, and we've been working on this with our team together to try and kind of visualize this. So we can sort of think of those rights and obligations as coming in as a group. And what community land trusts began to do, coming out of the civil rights movement in America, they began to say, hold on a minute, it's just a piece of paper. We can redesign what's on that piece of paper, right? So we can say, actually, let's have a low-cost way of owning this, but include rules that say, oh, by the way, you can't sell it for more than you bought it for. Or maybe you actually have some additional environmental stewardship obligations attached to this. So they begin to say, actually, rather than maximizing the financial value of land, if we see land as a platform, we start to say, how could you hold this land in a fair way that makes you its steward, as well as not at all a lord. And so they began to redesign ownership. And actually, one of a side project we're working on building is a library where all the people who know about these things and are studying them can share all these amazingly diverse models of ownership, different models of ownership that have existed throughout history and geography. Because ownership is not monolithic, and this is endlessly fascinating. So we want to make a library that people, and hopefully some of you as well, can use to kind of share and document some of these other ways of owning. But the really thing that we're really interested in working on is this idea of, well, wait a minute, what if we could take these ways of working and begin to build a new standard for owning a home? And so this is this idea we're working on called Fairhold, this idea that could we make a new type of home ownership? And of course, it's not really new, it's old. We're just talking about how to standardize and structure it and make template leases that are open source and really easy to reuse. And the idea of this is a form of ownership that allows you to own a home, but only as a place to live, not as a financial asset. And on the flip side, it would be a useful tool that can allow any landowner who wants to make land available as a platform for society, the economy, and the environment, instead of only to maximize their financial return. So hopefully it would be useful for community land trusts as a tool, but potentially could also be used by any landowner. There's a precedent for this, which is in another domain of property, intellectual property, right, which is Creative Commons licenses. They didn't ask for anyone's permission. They said, hey, we can come up with a family of template licenses which allow people to own and share their intellectual property in a different way. So really, in a way, we're sort of beginning to imagine, could we create a Creative Commons, but for home ownership? And so I won't go into as you can imagine, there's 1,000 endless details. We're working on a paper. Pulling together loads of the amazing ideas that people have contributed to this so far. But you can begin to imagine the kind of the scope of this possibility. The idea, the big vision, is that this is not about, just because this could be led at the edge, this could be led by any landowner anywhere, somewhere, it doesn't mean that it couldn't all begin to come back together again and truly be a way to slowly begin to transition us, what we call an opt-in transition. So rather than getting our trying to march on Westminster or trying to go for this political outcome that is not, I mean, hopefully it will happen, but it's going to be too slow coming. We can begin to build and realize this new future by this slow opt-in from community land trusts through landowners, local authorities, you know, lenders, policymakers, and begin to get them all kind of around this. So I'll finish with 3 questions that we kind of want to share. So the first one is, okay, if we can redesign ownership, how do we do it? What do you think is a fair way to own a home? Should you be able to inherit a house, for example? Is that fair or unfair? And just by way of fun, we've got these kind of fun cards that we've been working on, but actually there's a very, very basic online version that Ollie has just spun up. And you're very welcome to go to this link and just have a play with it and do your version and submit it, because it'll be really, really interesting to see what your thoughts are. The second one is, and again, Mark touched on this perfectly, effectively trying to change the land system is like trying to redesign the game of Monopoly while the players are still on the board. So how do we do that, right? How do we opt? How do we invite people in? How do we opt in? How do we find those cracks and those motivations why landowners would do this? And by the way, there are many. So we have to be we're going to have to be 10 times cleverer. We don't just get to envision a better future, a better way that a better way that ownership could work in the future. We also have to work out essentially a kind of guerrilla reform approach to get us there, and to get us there in time. So that's a kind of open question. Like, what are the tactics that we could use to create this system and invite the world to come into a better 21st century land system out of this, frankly, 11th century one we've inherited? And finally, in order to do that, who do we need in the room, right? And I've sort of already put here loads of the amazing people who we've already been speaking to, have already been contributing their ideas to this sort of work. This is not ours, as you know, we're driving this, but it's going to be a completely open source effort. But we're going to need to have seriously landowners, lenders, etc., etc. Who are the people who we need to have in the room? Who do you know who needs to be part of this effort if we're going to meaningfully give it a shot? With that, I'll shut up. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. What you don't know is while you were talking, the chat was alive, and like about 30 seconds before you started talking about Creative Commons, someone said, how do we talk more about the ownership of ideas and knowledge? It was beautiful. So yes, just to answer that question that's in the, run people who need to go and pick up people from school, and we will share the synthesis as we build it, so you won't miss out completely. There was another conversation going on about, well, we're just talking about land. Is land the only form of ownership we're interested in? And it's not. It's a way into a conversation about ownership. It segments and interfaces and intersects with all sorts of other forms of ownership, which I think both Mark and Alistair have identified some of those places. We could come in through different routes. None of them are as monolithic as the land issue. None of them hold the same, just the big percentage stats that the stats that Alistair put up at the beginning. It's such a massive amount of wealth and value that gets moved around in land that it's a good one to use as the starting point, but we can repeat it out into other. We have about 5 minutes until we're going to release you all. We're going to do we'll do the quick plenary again. Well, just quickly before we do that, there's a third session. The third session is in around a month. We'll send out details about it. In the first half of that session, we'll look at uncertainty and risk and disaggregating the two and mitigating risk and working with uncertainty to power transition. So that'll be the first half. And the speakers are amazing. And the second half is our subject approach, and we're looking at new economic thinking and what that means, like what new economic modelling means, how we do it, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what it would, how we can move away from the determinism that powers what we have at the moment. We are going to let's do the plenary bit really super quickly, 1 minute each. I'd like, if you have something to say, just say something as well. Don't leave it just to us. If someone feels really strongly that they need to say something in this next 4 minutes, say it. Okay. Right, Mona.
Yes, we were really lucky to be joined by Josh from Centric Lab. So I want to flag their work in this space as well, because it's very profound and has a strong importance in our time. So he told us a bit about how some of these ownership questions are also rooted in feudalism and Christianity, some of those deeper held beliefs about land equals productivity and not so much land equal being with us, or we are part of a larger ecosystem. So the separation of human and land, yeah, we need to unpack that more in our conversation. So it's not only colonialism or capitalism that is the root cause of these things. And then we talked a bit about the idea that we've been sold that there's only one or two ownership models, and that we need to challenge that. And there's like a plural pool of ownership models that we can apply, and they will all be contextual. And a group of people coming together, we can start to map out, so we can see what are those leverage points and figure out what is the model that would work in our context. Yeah, very, very short and fast.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel?
Yeah, we had a really interesting and far too short conversation. We started in the high street. Tony and Lorna were talking about the value of the potential value of the high street, but also the lack of understanding of who owns the high street. That often people think that it's publicly owned, but it's not. However, it is a public asset. Particularly Tony, who works with nomadic communities, was talking about kind of the value that high streets have as an asset for nomadic communities to kind of express and be present in those public spaces. We moved on to the idea that in order to kind of shift ownership, we have to acknowledge the fact that power structures are there to try to keep their own structures stable. And so we need to figure out better ways to destabilize and get comfortable destabilizing those systems. Stuart had a really nice phrase about putting the power of the unusual into boardrooms and policymaker spaces, and how do we kind of mitigate or anticipate some of that destabilizing ourselves rather than wait until it becomes inevitable because of climate change or overpopulation, economic collapse, etc. And the last thing I want to touch on was a really great question from Charles, which kind of turned this whole idea of ownership on its head, which was, are we trying to envision a future in which everyone owns everything, or are we trying to envision a future where ownership isn't even relevant anymore and that no longer becomes part of the conversation? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That's so much to say. It's 3:30. I'm going to keep us going to 3:35. If you need to leave, leave. And I'm sorry we're running over, but I just want to get the last little bits in. Okay. Sophia.
Lots reflected in what's already been said. Just a couple of other points from our discussion. We did talk, it's come up in the chat as well, about kind of thinking beyond sort of property and land alone in relation to ownership, and thinking about other things that are costing us lots of money at the moment, these kind of secret rents, so energy, water, but what else is there, and can we kind of experiment and play with concepts of ownership around those. Related to that, we talked about the importance of kind of having spaces and places where this stuff is being actively built, these alternatives being built. So keep getting it out of the kind of theory and into the action and learning together. And then finally, Indra made a good point about not kind of pitting this as the landowners versus the non-landowners. Actually, some landowners are really part of these discussions. And so can we create a kind of common set of intention and aspirations and work together?
Great. And Seppi.
Again, very rich conversation, and I'll summarize quickly. One of the questions that stood out was, well, how do we help people who have not realized the extent of their power realize their power, and what do they do with it once they've realized it? There were questions around Creative Commons and knowledge sharing, and what platforms and methods and practices there are available for us to do this in more creative ways, more collaborative ways across sectors or organizations. And finally, the value of getting people who don't normally speak together to get this cross section of knowledge that hasn't fully been realized, they haven't traditionally been put together for ideas that could be transformative. And I'll leave it there.
Mark, do you want to, this is really putting you on the spot, but rather than it being me finishing this off, do you want to say what you heard in ours?
Oh, Lordy.
You don't have to.
I mean, I think there was some really interesting stuff around kind of around consent and who makes decisions about land, and how do we get involved in that. And I think also I was really struck, I put it in my comment in the chat, like how much kind of words like trauma and violence and actual violence kind of come up in the enforcement of property rights and in their execution. And how we lack the stories to really tell this stuff. So there's lots of, someone said about the fact that people think that the high street is publicly owned, and I think there's an awful lot of like misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the fundamentals of ownership and who owns what, and the impacts that has that prohibit us from even beginning to think about how we change that. So what are the narratives? What are the stories that we can tell that kind of bring about that shared understanding and begin to put us into kind of the potential for collective reimagining, I suppose, were things that jumped out at me from that conversation.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the other thing was, and I put it in the chat, that there's if we were to identify a land reform movement, which we probably can, both explicitly and also implicitly, some of the work that's going on, if we were to gather those together, it is very under-resourced. So as an infrastructure layer, it is not a well-resourced layer. So if we're going to change things, we probably need to look at how we resource that layer, because that is where the narrative will come from. That was,
I will actually second that.
Yeah, well, obviously you will. Okay, right, we're well over. I'm sorry. We will leave it at that. Thank you all for staying to the end.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It's such an amazing set of conversations. I know the bits I was in were brilliant, and the feedback suggests that it was everywhere. So thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions, and to Team Iris and Birch for holding the space for us all.
Brilliant. Thank you all. See you hopefully at the next one.